When I received a letter from a law firm in the small town of Lynchburg, I assumed it was a mistake. The letter informed me that I had inherited a house from a distant relative I'd never heard of. Yet the name was mine, and all the legal details seemed legitimate. It was an odd feeling, a mix of excitement and unease. Having spent my life in rented apartments, I had always dreamed of owning a home, but the idea of inheriting one from a stranger left me apprehensive. A week later, I found myself standing in front of the house. It was an old mansion with faded yellow walls and a crumbling porch. Its windows seemed like eyes watching me. The wind played with the branches of an ancient oak tree near the entrance, and the rustling leaves made me glance over my shoulder. The house looked as though it had witnessed centuries, holding countless secrets within its walls. Inside, the atmosphere was just as unsettling as the exterior. Faint light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The furniture was old but well-preserved. A massive table in the living room, heavy chairs with intricate carvings on their backs, and even a piano in the corner. The air carried the scent of dust and aged wood. I spent the first few hours exploring the rooms. Each one had an eerie detail: creaking floorboards, a painting with unervingly vivid eyes that seemed to follow me. But the most intriguing discovery was a small wardrobe in one of the second-floor bedrooms. It was locked, and I couldn't find a key anywhere. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I began to sense the house's presence. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the old pipes occasionally let out strange sounds, almost like distant sobs. Despite the eerie noises, I was so exhausted from the day that I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I decided to focus on the wardrobe. After half an hour of searching, I found a small, rusty key tucked away in a desk drawer. Excited, I hurried upstairs and inserted the key into the lock. With a soft click, the doors creaked open. Inside, I discovered a dollhouse covered in a layer of dust. It was an exact replica of the mansion, crafted with painstaking detail. Every room matched the real ones, complete with miniature furniture, windows, and even the small rug in the living room. It was fascinating, yet something about it left me uneasy. On the dollhouse's first floor, I noticed tiny dolls. One of them looked eerily familiar. It seemed to have my hairstyle and wore clothes almost identical to what I had on that day. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as my imagination. I decided the dollhouse was just a peculiar keepsake left behind by the house's previous owners and returned it to its place. But this was only the beginning of the strange events that would make me question what I had truly inherited. The first few days in the house passed relatively uneventfully, though the dollhouse continued to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Every time I passed the room where the wardrobe stood, I felt as though something inside was watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But one night, something happened that shattered those reassurances. I was sitting in the living room when I heard a faint creak from the second floor. It was the kind of sound a door makes when it slowly swings open. I froze, straining to listen, but the house returned to silence. Convinced it was just a draft, I went back to reading. My nerves settled for a while. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was a faint tapping sound, almost like tiny footsteps. Grabbing a flashlight, I followed the sound up to the second floor. It led me to the room with the wardrobe. When I stepped inside, I saw the wardrobe doors were open. I was certain I had locked them earlier. Lying on the floor in front of the dollhouse was one of the dolls. Its position was unsettling. It lay face down with its arms stretched forward, as though it had been crawling toward the door. My pulse quickened. I picked up the doll and placed it back inside the dollhouse, then shut the wardrobe doors and locked them. As I made my way back to the bedroom, a sudden chill brushed the back of my neck. The windows were all closed. The next morning, I decided to examine the dollhouse more closely. When I opened the wardrobe, I was greeted by an unnerving sight. The dolls had moved. The ones that had been in separate rooms were now gathered together in the miniature living room. All their tiny heads were turned toward the doll that looked like me. Anxiety clawed at me for the rest of the day. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had tampered with the wardrobe before I arrived, and the dolls had shifted due to the house's age or some mechanism in the dollhouse. But that night, things escalated. As I lay in bed, I heard the creak again, the unmistakable sound of the wardrobe doors opening. Swallowing my fear, I got up and went to investigate. When I reached the room, my flashlight revealed tiny tracks leading from the wardrobe to the doorway. The prints were eerily detailed, as if left by miniature hands or feet. The wardrobe doors were open, and the dollhouse had changed once more. A new figure now stood inside, a man in black, positioned near the entrance of the dollhouse. I was certain this doll hadn't been there before. Something about its silhouette was disturbingly familiar. It reminded me of someone I had seen in passing during my move, a stranger in the crowd. A wave of cold dread gripped me. I locked the wardrobe again and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and groan the house made. The next morning, I resolved to get rid of the house. But I soon realized that leaving wouldn't be so simple. Over the following days, an oppressive sense of unease grew. The house felt alive. It was as if the walls were listening to my thoughts, the floorboards responding to my every step. I woke each morning with the uncanny sensation of being watched. Even with the wardrobe locked, the dollhouse seemed to exude an unsettling presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the source of the house's malevolent energy. One day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The dollhouse had to go. I carried it out of the house, placing it on the back seat of my car. The plan was simple: drive to the nearest dump and get rid of the cursed thing. But something unusual happened on the way. As I drove down an empty stretch of road, the car suddenly stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I turned the key again and again, but the engine refused to start. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, hoping for a simple fix. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound. I turned toward the car and saw the rear door slowly creak open on its own. The dollhouse was still on the seat where I'd left it, but one of the dolls had shifted. It leaned forward against the window, its tiny face pressed to the glass as though it were watching me. Fear surged through me, turning into outright panic. I grabbed the dollhouse, carried it to the side of the road, and threw it into the nearest patch of bushes. Then, hurrying back to the car, I tried the ignition one last time. To my relief, the engine roared to life. I sped away, not daring to look back. But in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure, the same man in black whose doll had appeared in the house, stood in the middle of the road. He didn't move, just stared directly at me as I drove away. Back at the house, I felt an initial wave of relief. It didn't last long. That night, I heard the creak of floorboards coming from the living room. Gripping a kitchen knife, I crept downstairs, every step heavy with dread. The room appeared empty at first glance, but then I saw it sitting in the center of the coffee table. A small doll, identical to the one from the dollhouse, its tiny, lifeless eyes staring up at me. My attempts to rid myself of the dollhouse proved futile. No matter how far I discarded it or where I left it, it always found its way back into the house. It was as if the dollhouse possessed its own will, a sinister, unyielding force. But what terrified me most was the new doll, the man in black, who now appeared in increasingly unnerving poses inside the miniature house. One evening, I resolved not to open the wardrobe again. But as I lay in bed, I was startled awake by a loud banging sound. At first, I thought it was the front door, but the noise seemed to come from within the walls. My heart pounded as I crept downstairs, only to find the wardrobe doors once again ajar. The dollhouse was back in its place, but now all the dolls, except one, were clustered near the miniature living room door. The doll resembling me stood alone by the tiny staircase, its hands raised as though pleading for help. A cold sweat broke over me at the sight. The house had grown eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Yet I knew I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it, a shadow, standing in the doorway of my bedroom. The figure of a man dressed in black, watching me. His eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow hue that seemed to reflect my growing terror. I tried to flee, but as I rushed downstairs, I discovered that all the doors were locked. Even the windows, those that usually opened without issue, were now sealed tight. A crushing sense of entrapment overwhelmed me. I decided I had to destroy the dollhouse to end this nightmare. Armed with a hammer from the basement, I returned to the wardrobe in the dead of night. My hands trembled as I opened the doors, but just as I raised the hammer to strike, the lights in the living room flickered out. I was plunged into darkness, where the only sounds were my ragged breathing and footsteps. Soft but deliberate, they grew closer. Panic took hold, and I swung the hammer wildly into the void. But nothing happened. When the lights came back on, the dollhouse stood untouched, and lying next to it on the floor was a new doll. It was a replica of me, but now its tiny face was contorted in a frozen scream. My grip on reality began to falter. The man in black appeared everywhere, reflected in mirrors, lurking in the shadows outside windows, even invading my dreams. I realized the house wasn't just a place. It was a trap designed to consume fear. The next morning, I sought help in town. An elderly woman there recounted the story of the house's previous owner, a woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. She left behind nothing but whispers of a cursed dollhouse. The woman warned me that the dolls were souls trapped between worlds. If a doll resembling me had appeared, it meant I was next. I would become part of the collection. Armed with this grim understanding, I returned to the house with a new plan: to burn the dollhouse. I gathered everything I needed, lit a roaring fire in the fireplace, and tossed the cursed miniature inside. But the flames refused to consume it, as though some invisible force shielded the dollhouse from harm. That's when the house came alive. The walls trembled, doors slammed open and shut, and a chilling laugh echoed from the wardrobe. Chaos erupted around me as I stood in the center of the storm. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth snuffed out, plunging the room into utter darkness. My heart pounded like a drum, each beat louder than the last. Then I heard it, a faint voice whispering my name. I turned and saw him, the man in black. He stood just feet away, his hand outstretched toward me. A bone-chilling cold seeped into my body, and I felt my strength leave me. Everything went black. When I regained consciousness, everything around me was silent. A chilling, oppressive silence that made me feel utterly alone in the dreadful house. I lay on the living room floor, the hammer beside me, while the dollhouse stood once again in the wardrobe, as though nothing had happened. But I knew now I was no longer alone. My fear had reached its peak, but with it came a grim determination. If this house and the dollhouse wanted to break me, I had to find a way to stop them. Deep down, I understood that there had to be an escape hidden somewhere within this cursed place. I began searching for answers. I turned back to the diary I'd found in one of the rooms, entries written by the previous owner. They detailed her desperate attempts to understand the nature of the dollhouse. One of the final entries read, "Asterisk, the key to everything is in the basement, but I'm too afraid to go down there. Fear is their weapon." Asterisk, those words sent a shiver down my spine. I had always avoided the basement, where the stench of dampness mixed with a sickly sweet odor. But now I had no choice. Armed with a flashlight and the hammer, I forced open the heavy basement door and descended into the darkness. The air was cold and heavy, pressing in on me as though the walls themselves were alive. Each step echoed loudly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive space. The flashlight beam illuminated cobweb-covered shelves, broken crates, and decaying wooden beams. At the far end of the basement, I saw something unusual, symbols carved directly into the stone wall. They looked ancient, depicting strange figures and patterns. At the center of the wall was an opening like a door, but without hinges or a handle. I thought I heard whispers. They seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere, distant yet intimate. I approached the wall, and in that moment, the symbols began to glow faintly with an otherworldly blue light. The opening shifted, as though being pulled apart by an unseen force. Beyond the opening was a small chamber. In its center stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a doll made of wood and metal. Its eyes were hollow black, and it clutched a tiny key in its hands. My gut told me this key was vital, perhaps the only way to destroy the dollhouse. But as I reached for it, the house came alive. The ceiling trembled, dust raining down from the cracks above. The walls of the basement began to close in, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The doll was icy cold in my hands, and I bolted up the stairs, feeling the house's malevolence trying to drag me back. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled into the living room. There waiting for me were the other dolls. They stood on the floor in a semicircle, as though they'd been expecting me. At the center of the circle was the doll that resembled me. It now held a tiny knife in its hands, and I realized the house was preparing its final trap. Without hesitation, I ran to the fireplace. Grabbing a bottle of alcohol from the shelf, I doused the dollhouse and struck a match. Flames erupted, consuming the miniature house as it cracked and hissed, emitting sounds disturbingly similar to screams. Yet the house did not relent. The walls around me began to shudder violently, and an icy chill enveloped the room. Summoning my last reserves of strength, I took the wooden and metal doll from the basement and smashed it with the hammer. The moment it shattered, everything went silent. The dollhouse crumbled into ash, and the house itself fell eerily still. I staggered outside, watching as the cursed house was engulfed in flames. For the first time in days, I felt a fragile sense of freedom. Yet deep in my soul, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The flames devoured the house as I stood at a distance, watching the fire consume what once seemed to be an unbreakable curse. Shadows from the blaze danced across the ground, creating the illusion of ghosts clawing their way into freedom. My heart pounded faster than ever, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I sensed a faint glimmer of liberation. When the house finally collapsed, I told myself it was over. But was it? A gnawing doubt stirred within me, a feeling that something remained unresolved. My gaze drifted downward, and amidst the ash at my feet, I saw a charred fragment of the dollhouse. I picked it up, and despite its scorched appearance, the shard felt unnaturally cold in my hand. Returning to my car, I resolved to leave town for good. My body craved rest, and my mind yearned for forgetfulness. The road stretched ahead like an endless ribbon, and I felt the weight of my fears begin to fade behind me. But after just a few miles, the car's engine sputtered, groaned, and abruptly died. I was left stranded on a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by an ominous forest. Stepping out of the car, I checked for any obvious issue, but found nothing. Everything seemed in perfect condition. The silence around me was suffocating. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. Returning to the car, I froze as I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. There, among the trees, stood the figure of the man in black. His sickly yellow eyes glowed in the shadows, piercing through the darkness like twin embers. I screamed and frantically turned the ignition. The engine roared to life immediately, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the road. Yet the further I drove, the more it felt as though the road was looping endlessly, the forest growing denser, and the daylight dimming into an unnatural twilight. After what felt like an hour of futile attempts to escape, I stopped the car. My phone had no signal, and the realization hit me hard. I was truly alone. Despair threatened to swallow me, but I knew that if this thing was hunting me, I had to fight back. Gripping the fragment of the dollhouse, I stepped out into the cold night air. I gathered dry leaves and branches, creating a small fire on the ground. Without hesitation, I tossed the shard into the flames. The fire flared violently, illuminating the night with a blinding brightness. For a brief moment, I thought I heard a scream, a human, anguished cry, like a desperate plea for mercy. And then, the shadow appeared. The man in black emerged from the edge of the firelight, his form towering and imposing. I felt an icy dread crawl through my bones as he whispered, "You cannot destroy what has always been." His voice, soft yet resonant, echoed in my mind, reverberating with an ancient power. But the fire did its work. The fragment crumbled into ash, and the shadow began to dissipate with it. The man in black took a final step toward me, his hand reaching out. When his icy touch grazed my skin, I collapsed to the ground. When I opened my eyes, the forest was empty. The car started without hesitation this time, and as I drove, the looping road was gone. The trees thinned, and soon I was back on the highway, heading toward the city. I left the house, the dollhouse, and all their horrors far behind me. But as I drove into the rising sun, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something had followed me, something waiting for the right moment to return.